There is a specific kind of quiet that comes after something has been destroyed. I learned to recognize that quiet in places most people only know from photographs. I know what it sounds like to stand in a space where something used to be and feel the absence of it pressing against you. So, when I turned onto Whitmore Lane on a Thursday afternoon in late September and saw open sky where my garage roof should have been, I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone. I put the car in park. I sat for exactly 63 seconds, and then I got out and started taking photographs. But here is what I need you to understand before we go any further, because this story isn't really about a garage. The garage is just where it starts. A decorated Army structural engineer spent 20 years calculating load tolerances, assessing blast damage, and building things that had to stand up under conditions most people never encounter. He came home to Caldwell, bought a house in a quiet subdivision, renovated a detached workshop garage to the precise letter of every applicable code, pulled every permit, had the work signed off by the county, and one day he left town for 10 days to help a family member, and he came back to a concrete slab, a demolition bill for $38,000, and a letter from the Pelham Crossing Homeowners Association informing him that his structure had posed a danger to the community. What the HOA did not know, and what Hargrove Development Partners apparently forgot to mention when they handed the board that paperwork, was exactly what kind of engineer was going to walk back through that front door. This is the story of how a real estate developer worth $90 million tried to use a suburban HOA as a quiet demolition crew, and how the one homeowner they picked was the single worst possible choice they could have made. I want you to hold one question in the back of your mind as I walk you through all of this. At what point in this story did the HOA board cross the line from being manipulated into being complicit? Because I asked myself that question for a long time. My attorney asked it. The jury had to answer it, and I'm still not entirely sure any of us got it right. My name is Marcus. For the purposes of this story, that is all you're going to get. No last name, no address beyond the fictional town of Pelham Crossing in Morrow County, Caldwell. What I will tell you is what I did for a living, because it is central to everything that follows. 21 years in the United States Army as a structural and civil engineer. 2 deployments overseas, rotations through Germany, South Korea, and 2 forward operating bases I am still not permitted to describe in detail. By the time I separated from service in 2018, I had overseen the assessment, construction, or controlled demolition of more than 400 discrete structures. Bridges, field hospitals, hardened barracks, prefabricated command posts. I understood structural load calculations the way other people understand their own handwriting. Instinctively, without having to think through every step. I also held, and still hold, a professional engineer's license under the Caldwell State Board of Engineering, PE License 91142. That license allows me to serve as the engineer of record on residential projects within the state, to stamp and certify engineering documents, and to testify in court as a qualified expert witness on structural and construction matters. I mention this because all 3 of those things became relevant. When I retired, I wanted something small, a house I could work on in a neighborhood quiet enough to think. I found a 1988 brick ranch at 2814 Whitmore Lane in Pelham Crossing, Morrow County. 3 bedrooms, decent bones, a deteriorating 2-car detached garage in the back. The subdivision fell under the Pelham Crossing Homeowners Association. The CC and Rs were standard. Exterior appearance standards, lawn maintenance requirements, rules about parking commercial vehicles on the street. Nothing unusual. I had seen governing documents far more aggressive during my time handling base housing compliance. Over the course of 2021 and into early 2022, I renovated that garage. I contracted out the concrete and framing work and acted as the engineer of record on the project, which I was explicitly authorized to do under my PE license and under Caldwell Residential Code Section 81.4, which permits a licensed professional engineer to self-certify residential structure designs below a specified square footage threshold. I pulled Permit CP-4491-22 from the Morrow County Building Department. I had the foundation surveyed. I documented every material specification and every structural calculation in a bound project file. The garage, when complete, sat 24 feet, 7 inches from the rear property line. Morrow County Code. Section 14.6 required a minimum 10-foot setback for accessory structures. The Pelham Crossing CC and Rs required a minimum of 12 feet under their own more restrictive standard, 24 feet, 7 inches. I was more than double the required setback under the strictest applicable standard. Every permit was framed and mounted inside the garage, next to the drafting table where I worked on evenings and weekends. The space also contained 11 years of accumulated hand tools, a Milwaukee panel saw, a bench grinder, an air compressor, welding equipment, and a partially restored 1968 Ford F-100 pickup I had been rebuilding since before I left the service. I had documented every component of that truck, every replaced part, every hour of labor, in a separate log I kept for insurance purposes. All of it was gone when I got home. I want to describe the afternoon I came back to that slab, because the order in which I processed information matters to what happened next. I had been in the Briar Hills area of the state, about 4 hours north of Pelham Crossing, for 9 days. My father had suffered a minor stroke in late August, and I had gone to manage his recovery care and give my mother some relief. I left on a Friday morning, September 8th. I returned on a Sunday afternoon, September 17th. The drive home was unremarkable. I remember the weather was clear. The garage was gone before I got to the driveway. I could see the sky over the back of the lot from the street. I parked. I sat, as I said, for 63 seconds. I know because I counted. Because counting is a habit from years of working in environments where silence meant something was wrong, and you needed to know exactly how long it had been. Then I got out and walked the perimeter of the property. The foundation slab remained. The perimeter of the concrete pad was intact, though there were flecks of material at the edges, insulation foam, roofing debris, suggesting a cleanup crew had not finished the job. No debris pile, no temporary fencing, no construction notice or posted permit for demolition work. Nothing to indicate this had been a sanctioned municipal action. Just the sky and the slab, and a smell of cut wood still faintly in the air. Taped to my front door was a letter on Pelham Crossing HOA letterhead. I'm going to read you the 3 most relevant sentences, because they are the sentences I have read approximately 400 times since that afternoon, and they are the sentences from which every single thing that followed can be traced. Dear Mr. Webb, the board of the Pelham Crossing Homeowners Association hereby notifies you that on September 14, 2023, the board authorized emergency abatement of a non-conforming accessory structure at your property pursuant to Article 9, Section 4 of the Pelham Crossing Declaration of Covenants. The structure was found to be in violation of the 12-foot rear setback requirement under CC and R Section 7.3, B, and was determined by a certified inspector to constitute an imminent safety hazard to adjacent properties. A fee of $38,000 has been assessed to your account, representing abatement costs and administrative penalties. $38,000. Emergency abatement. Imminent safety hazard. I went to the garage site and I measured the slab from my PE tape measure, which I keep in the truck because I'm a structural engineer, and measuring things is a reflex. Distance from the rear edge of the foundation to the rear property line marker, 24 feet, 6 3/4 inches. I wrote that number in my notebook, underlined it twice. Then I went inside, and I poured a glass of water, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I started building a file. In the Army, we called the first phase pattern analysis. The principle is simple. You do not theorize before you have data, and you do not act before you understand the shape of what you're looking at. Every experienced engineer knows that the most dangerous mistakes are made by people who decided what was wrong before they finished measuring. So, I didn't call a lawyer first. I called the HOA management company, Summit Property Management, the firm contracted to handle day-to-day operations for Pelham Crossing. I spoke to a representative named Claire, who was professional, measured, and entirely unhelpful in the polite way that trained frontline staff are unhelpful when they have been told to absorb incoming complaints without providing information. She confirmed the abatement had occurred. She confirmed the $38,000 assessment. She told me I had 30 days to appeal in writing. When I asked her the name of the certified inspector who had identified the safety hazard, she told me that information was not available to homeowners. When I asked her for the name of the demolition contractor, she told me that was proprietary. When I asked her for the specific engineering finding that had supported the safety determination, she said a supervisor would call me back. I marked the date and time of that call in my notes. No supervisor ever called. I attended the October HOA board meeting, held in the Pelham Crossing Clubhouse. The board comprised 5 members. The president was a man named Gerald Ashworth, retired insurance executive, late 60s, the kind of man who runs a meeting like it is a performance of competence. The other 4 members were a retired teacher, a woman who worked in pharmaceutical sales, a man who had been in residential real estate 15 years earlier and now seemed to be primarily a golfer, and a 5th member I could find almost no public record on despite a thorough search. I introduced myself, gave my address, cited the setback measurement I had taken myself, noted my PE credentials and my permit documentation, and explained with precision that the basis for the abatement did not exist. I said I intended to pursue every legal avenue available to me. I said this calmly. I have given briefings in rooms where the stakes were considerably higher than a garage, and I have learned that the most effective delivery is quiet. Gerald Ashworth looked at me for approximately 4 seconds and said, "Mr. Webb, the board takes its obligations to the community seriously. You're welcome to file your appeal in writing before the deadline." He moved on to the next agenda item. It was about the holiday lighting policy for the December season. I stayed through the entire meeting, not because I expected anything further, but because I was watching the board dynamics, and because midway through new business there was a moment, brief, deflected quickly by Ashworth, when a homeowner in the back row asked about a rumored commercial development in the open space corridor behind Whitmore Lane. Ashworth said it was in preliminary stages. He said more information would be shared at the appropriate time. He did not look at the homeowner when he said it. I wrote down, open space corridor, development, Whitmore Lane. Ashworth deflected. That note became the thread that unraveled the entire thing. I submitted my records request the following morning under the Caldwell Homeowner Transparency Act, Statute 61D, which entitles homeowners to inspect all meeting minutes, financial records, communications, and governance documents related to enforcement decisions within 30 days of request. Summit Property Management took the full 30 days to respond. When the packet arrived, it was extensive. It was also approximately 35% redacted. Not specific sensitive passages, but entire pages blacked out, including what appeared from context to be the full minutes of the August 28th board meeting. I put the package aside and pulled the county planning records. I need to stop and ask you something. Because this is the kind of moment where most people I've told this story to either completely understand why I kept going, or they think I went too far. Sitting in my house, 9 days after coming home to an empty concrete slab, spending the better part of 3 evenings pulling county documents instead of just letting an attorney handle it. Some people see that as reasonable. Some people say I was obsessed. I'd genuinely like to know where you fall. Drop it in the comments. What I found in the Morrow County Planning Department's public filing portal was this. 14 days before my garage was demolished, a company called Hargrove Development Partners had filed a preliminary development application with the county for a mixed-use residential and commercial project on 78 acres in the Pelham Crossing open space corridor. The application was for a project to be called Whitmore Commons. Phase 1, 110 market-rate townhomes. Phase 2, a 40,000 square foot commercial strip with surface parking. The proposed development site backed directly against the rear property lines of 6 homes on Whitmore Lane, including mine. And on page 11 of Hargrove's preliminary site plan, a document filed with Morrow County and therefore available to anyone patient enough to request it, there was a proposed utility and access corridor, 14 feet wide, running along the rear boundary of those 6 properties. According to Hargrove's own engineering drawings, the corridor was designed to accommodate sewer, electrical, and stormwater infrastructure for Phase 1 of the project. The access corridor bisected the rear of my lot at a point approximately 18 feet from where my garage had stood. My garage had not been over the property line. It had not been too close to it. But it had been visible on satellite imagery, documented in county permit records, and identifiable from any aerial view of the lot as an existing structure that a development company would want removed before they began formal negotiations over that corridor. I sat with that for a long time. I called Priya Mehta the next morning. She was a property rights attorney in the Caldwell Capitol, recommended by a former colleague who described her as someone who turns discovery into a surgical instrument. I told her what I had found. She asked me to courier everything to her office that afternoon. She called me 2 days later. She said, "Marcus, I want you to know 2 things. First, you have a strong case. Second, you need to stop pulling records yourself, because from this point forward, everything you find needs to come through formal discovery, so it can't be challenged on process grounds." She filed suit in Morrow County Civil Court within the week. The complaint, named the Pelham Crossing, HOA, Summit Property Management, and Hargrove Development Partners as defendants. Causes of action included wrongful demolition of a lawfully permitted structure, conversion of personal property, fraudulent invocation of emergency authority, civil conspiracy, and violation of Caldwell Statute 61D governing transparency obligations. We sought $189,000 in actual damages, $41,200 for the garage replacement and permit replication, $62,800 for the tools and workshop equipment, $58,000 for the F-100 at assessed restoration value, and $27,000 in documented labor costs for time I had personally spent on the vehicle, plus punitive damages and attorney's fees. The HOA's law firm, a shop called Greystone and Falk that appeared to exclusively represent association boards and management companies, responded within 3 weeks. They called our claims frivolous. They said the board had acted within its emergency authority. They said I was not entitled to compensation for a structure removed pursuant to valid community governance. They did not, in their entire 17-page response, address the Hargrove development application. They did not mention the access corridor. They did not acknowledge that a development company had filed county documents referencing my property 2 weeks before my garage was demolished. Priya said that omission was more telling than anything they had said. Discovery ran for 6 months. What came out of it answered the question I'd been carrying since the night I came home. But the answer was more complicated than I had expected, and in some ways harder to sit with. Priya subpoenaed Summit Property Management's complete communications for the prior 18 months. She subpoenaed the HOA board's email accounts. She subpoenaed Hargrove Development's internal project files for the Whitmore Commons application. And she deposed Gerald Ashworth. I was not present for the deposition, but Priya gave me a detailed account. She walked Ashworth through the timeline. She asked when the board had first been contacted by anyone associated with Hargrove Development Partners. He said he didn't recall specifics. She produced an email recovered in discovery, sent to Ashworth's personal address on August 2nd, from a Hargrove project coordinator named Wade Tilson. The email described the Whitmore Commons project, noted that certain accessory structures in the corridor zone were creating complications for the preliminary site plan, and asked whether the association might have any applicable enforcement mechanisms that could address the situation in advance of the county filing. Ashworth had replied within 48 hours. His reply said, "I'll speak to the board and see what's available under our CC&Rs." Priya placed Ashworth's reply in front of him during the deposition and asked him when that had occurred relative to the board's emergency abatement vote. He said he did not recall the precise timeline. She showed him the August 28th board meeting minutes, the ones that had been redacted in the package sent to me. In discovery, the unredacted version had been produced. The minutes showed that the board had voted 4-1 on an emergency abatement authorization for non-conforming structure at 2814 Whitmore Lane. The sole dissenting vote had belonged to the retired teacher. He had never been told there was a PE stamped permit on file. The minutes showed no reference to an engineering inspection. No inspector's report had been attached. The emergency authority invocation had been based entirely on a verbal briefing given by Ashworth, who had characterized the structure as likely non-conforming based on a visual observation. I want to stop there, because that is the question that kept me up the most. Gerald Ashworth and 3 members of that board voted to demolish a homeowner's property based on a man's verbal assertion and a request from a developer, without pulling the county permit records that were publicly available and would have answered the question in 30 seconds. Was that malice, stupidity, or a board that had been so carefully fed a story that they genuinely believed they were doing the right thing? I don't have a clean answer. Priya has a view. I have a different one. Leave yours below. The deposition broke for an extended recess at that point. 2 weeks later, Greystone and Falk contacted Priya to discuss settlement terms for the HOA and Summit Property Management. Hargrove Development Partners and Wade Tilson personally declined to settle. The trial lasted 5 days in Morrow County District Court. I testified for 7 hours across 2 days. I presented my structural compliance report, 31 pages, PE stamped, covering every measurement, every permit reference, every material specification, and a post-demolition GPS survey of the surviving foundation slab confirming the setback at 24 feet, 6 3/4 inches. I presented the permit, which Priya had obtained through county records since my framed copy had been removed with everything else. I presented the Hargrove site plan with the corridor overlay. I presented Tilson's email and Ashworth's reply. I presented the board minutes showing no inspector's report. When Hargrove's defense counsel suggested in cross-examination that the garage might have been structurally unsound and that the board had acted in good faith on that basis, I pointed out that no engineering report had ever been produced, that no inspector had ever provided a finding of record, and that under Caldwell Administrative Code Section 44.7, a formal engineer's assessment is a prerequisite for any HOA to invoke emergency abatement authority on a permitted structure. They had not obtained one. They had not attempted to obtain one. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. The verdict came back on a Thursday, fitting, I thought, since Thursdays had become a day I associated with returns I hadn't asked for. Hargrove Development Partners was found liable on all primary counts. Wrongful demolition, $41,200. Conversion of personal property, $120,800, covering the tools, the workshop equipment, and the F-100. Punitive damages for civil conspiracy, $275,000. Attorney's fees under Caldwell Statute 61. D. $48,000. Total judgment against Hargrove, $485,000. The HOA and Summit Property Management settled on the final day of trial for a separate amount I cannot disclose. The $38,000 fine was nullified in full. A court-appointed monitor was assigned to supervise the Pelham Crossing HOA's governance practices for 24 months. The 4 board members who had voted for the abatement resigned within 30 days of the verdict. The retired teacher who had voted against it, the sole dissenting vote, I found out later had tried to raise the question of the permit records in the board meeting, and had been told by Ashworth that they had already been reviewed and found insufficient. Hargrove's Whitmore Commons development application was denied by Morrow County Planning 2 months after the verdict. The denial cited the unresolved litigation record and concerns about the legal status of the proposed corridor easement. Wade Tilson left Hargrove Development Partners before the denial came through. I won. Let me be clear about that, because it matters. I won cleanly on the merits in front of 12 jurors who heard 5 days of evidence and came back with a verdict that covered every cause of action we had filed. But the F-100 is gone. The money doesn't give that back, not in the way that matters. You cannot restore 11 years of evenings in a garage with a check, even a large one. The truck existed in the gap between what I had been and what I was figuring out how to be after the Army, and that specific version of it, at that specific stage of being rebuilt, is gone. That is the part of the story I think about on mornings when the answer to "Did you win?" feels more complicated than yes. I also think about something I learned during discovery that had nothing to do with my own case. 3 years before my garage was touched, the HOA had sent an abatement notice to a homeowner 2 streets over, a woman named, for our purposes, Rita, who had a small garden shed that sat 9 feet from the rear property line. Under the CC and Rs, and that was a legitimate violation. She was 3 feet short of the required setback. She had paid a $6,200 fine without questioning it. She had assumed the HOA was correct. She moved away the following year. I connected Rita with a property rights legal clinic in Caldwell after the trial. I cannot tell you how that has resolved because it is ongoing. What I can tell you is that she no longer assumes the HOA was correct. There are approximately 370,000 homeowner associations operating in the United States right now. The vast majority run unremarkably, collections of people trying to maintain their neighborhood, making boring decisions about fence heights and landscaping. But some of those associations have become tools for interests that have nothing to do with the health of any community. And the architecture of HOA governance is perfectly suited to it. Volunteer boards without professional training, management companies with limited accountability, CC and RS dense enough to intimidate most homeowners out of fighting back, and a cultural assumption that the association is probably right and the homeowner probably made a mistake. The single most protective thing you can do is understand the language those documents use. Read your CC&Rs. Read your state's homeowner transparency statutes. Know what emergency authority actually requires before it can be invoked. Because in most states, the requirements are specific and procedural, and not at all what HOA boards tend to believe. And if you're ever handed a notice claiming a violation on something you built with permits, pull the permit record before you do anything else. In most counties, that takes 7 minutes. That is the thing that kept the whole system intact, the assumption that most people won't look. I looked. If this story stayed with you, not just as a revenge narrative, but as something that made you think about what you actually own and who can reach it, share it with someone who should hear it. Leave a comment below. Tell me, how far would you have gone? And where do you think the board crossed from being used into being willing? This is HOA Nightmares. I'll see you in the next one. Ow.